Hello and welcome to Real Cheating Story. The whistle blew as I stood up from my resting place next to the chain-link fence that enclosed the area where I, along with 20 other men, was getting my daily ration of fresh air. I kept as far away from the other cons as I could since I was not going to blow my chance of getting out by getting into trouble. Freedom was just too close for me to screw it up. I ambled over toward the far edge of the field and queued up with the other inmates waiting to file into the outer chamber leading from the exercise field to the main hallway of the prison. My name is Carmine Montoya, and I'm a charter member of the Inmates Society here at lovely Ohio State Penitentiary. I'm one of over 500 held courtesy of the state of Ohio. I'm in for assault and serving a sentence of 7 to 10 years. Actually, it was a plea bargain that got me here, but I was guilty, no question about it. I admitted it, and my attorney worked out the deal. He was court-appointed, but he did the job. He was happy that I had no complaints and wanted no appeal. I just wanted to serve my time and pay my debt to society. We had 2 hours a day outside, 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. This was the second, and the whistle signaled our hour. The sun was already low when the last man came through the sally port. The steel bar gate slammed shut behind him. The clang was one I was familiar with now, and it was just part of the background noise. Once it was shut, the gate in front of the first man in the queue slid open and we filed into the main hallway. I looked down the long sterile hallway, cells to the right and left, 2 levels high and most now filled, and thought to myself that this had been my home for the last 5 years. Some days we were the last group of the day to go outside. As always, we marched single file down that barren walk with guards at the head and the end of our column and one walking beside. No talking, no nothing, just silent marching, the sound of our prison-issue shoes echoing from the block walls. My group was on the ground floor, so we marched down the center, men peeling off in pairs to the left or right to enter their cells. The doors were all open, waiting for the command to shut them down. I was near the end and followed Owen Big O Potts, my current cellmate, as we moved out of line and into cell number 113. Owen jumped up to the top bunk while I took the bottom due to my seniority in this cell. The guard came past, looked in to see we were where we were supposed to be and that no one else was in with us. Then, after checking the full row, signaled to the gatekeeper. Once all were in and accounted for, the doors slid home with their own distinctive clang, and we were sealed in for the next 2 hours until the dinner march. "So, tomorrow's the day," Owen said. He was not much in the way of words, but this was a special occasion. "Yeah, tomorrow's the day." "It's going to be good to be out of here," I replied. I didn't normally say much either, which is why Owen and I were good cellmates. He had been with me for over a year now without either of us doing the other harm. "Yeah, good. You got my number, document." "I'm out in another month," Owen said. "I just hope I don't need it until parole is done." We were done talking until dinner. Silence was one of the premiums in a good cellmate. None of us liked to talk much after a few years inside. After all, when your world consisted of a barren cell and a cot with a stainless steel crapper, what was there to talk about? Most of the movies they showed were ancient, and the library held mainly rejected books from the local schools. Not a lot of stimulation. Owen Potts is in for manslaughter. He took a dislike to a man who threatened one of his kids. The man was also messing with his M, and Owen took issue with that. He put a knife into the guy's gut, just missing an artery. Fortunately, the guy survived, so Owen only got 15 years. His wife divorced him and he hadn't seen his kid for the last 10 years. Shortly after he was released from the hospital, the guy on the outside was mugged and killed in what the police called a random case of robbery. Funny, but it wasn't a surprise to Owen. All he said when he heard was, "Good job." He had already done most of his time, and like me, the parole board gave him a pass on the remainder. He'd kept his nose clean inside. It's good that society doesn't like to shell out good money for more and better prisons. It makes our time a lot shorter. I lay back, picking up the book I had been reading. It was a medical journal and it outlined several new procedures for resetting and aligning broken bones. I had kept up with the new procedures and discoveries in prison, and the librarian was good about getting the books I requested. I picked it up, looked at it for a few minutes, then put it down. I wanted something less technical and more exciting. I picked up a fiction novel, one of Lamb's works, always good for reading since it took forever to finish one. Deep, dark, convoluted, and violent, just the thing for a convict to waste time with. I had read all of his works that were in the prison library. My release was coming just in time. I had been in jail now for 5 years, 3 months, and 10 days. With the overcrowding in the state penal system, the courts had ruled that once a prisoner had served 70% of their minimum term, they were eligible for parole. The parole board had granted my parole on the third try. No one showed up to protest or advocate for my release, since I had made it clear I wanted no one I knew to know about my upcoming parole hearing. I asked only one man to speak on my behalf. I hadn't asked anyone else, and no one ever appeared for the other side, so it was pretty much a wash in that regard. But this time, I had a guarantee of a job and a place to live when I got out, courtesy of my old boss and friend, Jason Watley. He ran a private practice now in Columbus and wanted me to come in with him. He had made the necessary calls, and my license to practice had been renewed without issue since my crime had nothing to do with medicine, and I had passed the proficiency test. The parole board liked this, and the letter from Jason was complimentary, so they relented and gave me parole. During my time in prison, my only visitor was my sister, Eileen. She was married and had 3 kids of her own. She and her husband, Fred, moved into our parents' home in the suburbs of Cleveland after they were both killed in a car accident 3 years ago. Before that, Mom and Dad wanted to visit, but I begged them both to stay away. I hated for them to see me in here, but Mom had to come anyway. She and Eileen both came every couple of months until her death. Dad sent letters but honored my request. I think the whole idea pained him, however, they were gone now, and only Eileen came. We never talked about my ex and my kid. Eileen learned early on that I wanted no word of what they were doing. I had it in my head that they were better off without me. After all, I had lost it big time when I almost killed Hugo. I don't think I would have done anything to Nancy, but I wasn't sure, so I decided to put them in my past and move on. It seemed the best thing for all of us. When she visited a week ago, I told Eileen of my deal with Jason and she was delighted. We promised to keep in touch after I was released. She asked if I had a place to stay and needed anything. I told her Jason had everything under control, so not to worry. As soon as I was settled, I would call her and give her the information. Lying on my bunk and considering all of this, I sighed and tried to take a quick nap. Time seemed to be dragging even more slowly now than it did normally. All I had to do now was make it through dinner and then one more night in this hellhole, and I would be a free man. Free from what? Well, that was a matter of public record, so there's no harm in telling you. It was all because I beat a man almost to death. It was a close call, but he survived, and I was arrested and charged with assault with intent to kill. My court-appointed attorney helped me to a plea bargain that reduced the charge to simple assault. I was guilty and was willing to plead out, so it went through without a trial. I agreed to a term of not less than 7 and not more than 10 years if I would plead guilty. It was all very civilized, and I was bundled off to jail, out of sight of all those who wanted me lynched or acquitted. It seemed at the time there were more on the lynching side, but who was counting? What happened was very simple. I was a doctor on staff at a local hospital. I was a specialist in orthopedics, a bone doctor, and I had been on call for almost 18 hours when I clocked out for the day and went down to the wards. I had a patient on the ward that I wanted to visit before I went home. As it happens, during the time I was in-house, there was a serious accident and I was called to help. I worked trauma for the next 5 hours before an emergency surgery had to be performed on a man who could lose the use of his leg if it wasn't rebuilt properly. Since I was already there, I was paged and was in surgery for almost 6 more hours before I could get away by switching with a colleague. I had been on duty for over 30 straight hours. I got a colleague to take my next shift since I would be too tired to be effective, and he agreed. I got out of the hospital before any more could happen and got in my car to drive home. I had called my wife earlier to tell her I was going to be delayed, but that I would call if I could get away before my next scheduled shift. I hadn't remembered to call Nancy before I left, letting her know that I had switched, so I tried now. I called her cell phone just to be sure and got her voicemail. I left a message saying I was heading home. It was just after 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so I expected her to be home anyway. She worked part-time for a real estate company as a receptionist but wasn't scheduled to work today. I wasn't scheduled to be home until later that evening, so since she hadn't received my call, she would assume I was on shift. I pulled into the driveway and noticed a strange car already there. I had no idea who it could be and thought maybe it was a friend who had stopped by since Nancy was home. I dragged myself into the house, my mind clouded by fatigue after almost 30 straight hours of working. I looked around the kitchen and the rest of downstairs and found nobody home. My muddled brain concluded that they must be out shopping or something similar. Without any further thought, I headed for the stairs, my body barely making its way up to the bedroom and the shower. That's all I wanted now, a nice long hot shower and then a few hours in bed, all alone. Heaven. I walked into the bedroom and was met with a sight that remained etched in my memory. It's been over 5 years now, but if I try really hard, I can still recall my wife on the bed with another man. There was remarkably little sound, but I remember the rhythmic squeak of the bed as he moved. I don't know what I thought at that instant, but I didn't say a word. All I remember is turning away and walking out of the room. At this point, everything becomes a bit blurry. I tried to remember it later, but it was as if it happened to someone else and I was too tired to process it all. I know that I went out of the room, got a baseball bat from my son's room, and then returned to the bedroom where Nancy and her lover, Hugo, were still in the midst of their affair. I hit Hugo on the back with the bat, and when he noticed me, I swung it again, hitting him in the side and breaking several ribs. I continued to beat him with the bat until Nancy jumped on me, knocking me down. I apparently got up and tried to push her away before she ran into our son's room and locked the door. She called 911, and they arrived shortly after, finding me sitting in the family room, staring off into space, the bat still in my hands and covered in blood. When they asked me if I was all right, I couldn't answer. I just dropped the bat and stood up. I wasn't aware of anything at that point. Whatever was driving me before was gone. I couldn't respond when they asked me my name or anything else. My brain felt like it had shut down. I remained that way for days afterward. Hugo was still upstairs in our bed, unconscious. He was taken to the emergency room and, after a tense period, was stabilized. I had given him a concussion, broken several bones, and a couple of ribs. I was told later that he needed multiple surgeries, but he recovered with no complications. Nancy was not hurt and she told the police what happened. Since Hugo was there with my wife's permission, the state decided to charge me because I had attacked him while he was a guest in my house. The first thing I remember is sitting in a small room with a serious-looking man asking me questions. I woke up, looked at him strangely, then began to respond normally. At that point, a policeman came in, handcuffed me, and I was arraigned and charged with felony assault. This all happened several days later. I had been in a hospital, unresponsive for that time, but now I was magically cured and ready to face the consequences of my actions. Nancy tried to talk to me while I was in jail waiting for trial, but I refused to see her. She tried to post bail, but I refused and also refused her attempt to hire a lawyer. I was given a court-appointed attorney who told me that the state was anxious about their case since Nancy refused to testify against me, so they were willing to deal. I told him that I wanted to plead guilty, which caused him to argue with me, but I refused to discuss it further and told him to work it out. He wanted to know why I would do something so drastic. I let him rant until he seemed to have worn himself out, and then I calmly explained. I understood that my wife had cheated on me with the man I almost killed. I knew my judgment was impaired, and with my wife's unwillingness to testify, I could probably get off. But this was important to me in my sense of who I was. I had almost killed a man in anger, and for that, I insisted on paying for my actions. Besides, what was I going to go home to? A wife dissatisfied with me as a husband and a son who would likely come to hate me for what I had done. He listened, shaking his head, but in the end, it was my decision. I chose my fate when they arraigned me. I pleaded guilty, and the judge asked me a series of questions before finally accepting my plea. Sentencing was scheduled, and I told my lawyer to go for a deal. He was a good lawyer with a kind heart, so he did as I asked. I think he still tried to get me the best deal he could, so it wasn't all bad. Once I was sent to jail, I refused all attempts from Nancy to see me. I sent her a short note telling her never to try to see me or bring my son to visit. I made it clear that I would refuse to see him as well. I never wanted him to see where I was living. It would hurt me more than anything else if he saw his father behind bars. One of the reasons I pled guilty and accepted the plea deal was to avoid humiliating my wife and son. I promised myself that my actions would not reflect on them. It was my crime and my sin, and I would pay for it. My first year in jail was a real nightmare, but I got lucky. They paired me with a man named Bruno Kono, who was serving a life sentence for murder. When he learned that I was a doctor, he took a liking to me. He suggested that we could do pretty well if I offered medical advice while he handled the rest. I initially refused, but after an incident where I had looked at someone the wrong way, I agreed. He took it from there. Soon after, using my medical knowledge, I made a few friends, became known and respected, and was generally left alone. Bruno and I shared the benefits of my consulting, which usually consisted of cigarettes, candy, magazines, and the like. We did well, and I became relatively well off. Bruno was later transferred to a maximum security facility, and I was on my own. By then, I knew the ropes and managed to get by. After that first year, I was notified that Nancy was filing for divorce. She requested a meeting with me, but I sent her a note instead. I refused to see her and congratulated her on her new life. I told her to write her own terms, and I would sign without contesting it. I just wanted it over and done with. She could have everything: our house, cars, clothes, jewelry, and the nice bank account we had. I had kept an insurance policy that covered her and my son in case I couldn't work. I had no desire to contest it since I knew from the minute my fatigue set in that my marriage was over. I would miss my son, but I believed it was best for him not to see his father in prison. All of that happened years ago now, and I was able to forget most of it. I spent some time with the prison counselor and found that I could forgive Nancy for what she did to me. He told me that forgiveness was not for her benefit but for mine. He was right. I felt much better after that. Sometimes I went for weeks without thinking about my previous life, though I never stopped remembering my son and my wife. It's funny that I never stopped loving either of them, even after what she did. In my memory, her infidelity faded, and I remembered the good times. Spending so much time alone made the good times seem better and the bad times a little less harsh. The day of my release came, and believe it or not, I had a few emotional moments saying goodbye to some of the other inmates, including Tiny, who had saved my life a couple of times, Benny Five Fingers, Tony T, Pan, Willie, and several others. I had spent the past 3 years working in the prison hospital and had treated many of the other inmates. I even saved Benny's life by diagnosing a tumor, and Tiny received a reduced sentence after I identified a hormone imbalance affecting his behavior. These friends were the ones I would cherish in later years. We had been through a lot together, and that bond was unbreakable. I collected my few meager belongings and was escorted out of the gates. The sound of that big chain link fence slamming shut behind me was unique. I turned to see the source of that sound: freedom. The guard came over, locked the gate, and raised one hand in salute. I returned the gesture. Even the guards had their own kind of friendship with me. I blinked in the bright sunshine and saw Jason waiting for me in a bright red Cadillac CTS. He waved, and I walked slowly toward him, my shoulders hunched as if expecting trouble. He greeted me with a big hug and pushed me into the car. We drove away from the OSP, and I never looked back. That was 6 months ago, and now I was back in practice at Jason's clinic in Columbus, Ohio. We handled high-profile cases, focusing mainly on reconstruction, and the pay was excellent. I was already earning more than I ever had before and adjusting to living free again. It was a relief not to constantly look over my shoulder whenever I wanted to go somewhere or do something. At first, I would jump at every loud sound or flinch when I heard someone shout, but it was getting easier. I still looked around when entering buildings, checking for exits, and I had difficulty maintaining eye contact with others, a habit from my time inside where eye contact was often perceived as a threat. One restriction on my freedom was the requirement to report to my parole officer every 2 weeks. He mentioned that it wouldn't be long before he could ease up and just make random visits. He had all my information, address, work number, and I was under his supervision for the next 2 years. But otherwise, it was freedom, more than I had enjoyed in the past 5 years. I took the first month's earnings and found a small apartment on the outskirts of downtown. The rent was affordable because it was in a rundown neighborhood, but the apartment was spacious and filled with light. It had 2 large bedrooms and a full kitchen, though I mainly needed a microwave for frozen dinners. I managed to cover the first and last month's rent and bought a mattress, blankets, and a stockpile of canned and frozen meals. The rest of the furniture would come later as I earned more. I was used to much less, so this place felt like a luxury. Over the next few months, I furnished the apartment with items from yard sales and classifieds. I didn't need expensive things anymore. Prison had given me a different perspective. By the end of 5 months, I had a real bed, a dresser, a chest, a couch, a TV, and a kitchen table with 3 chairs. The second bedroom remained empty, and I was content with that. I let Al know my new address and phone number, and she promised to stay in touch. She wanted to know my plans, but I only said I wanted to get used to normal life again and focus on my job. The rest would come in time. When I found myself bored, I contacted a private investigator that Tiny had recommended. Tiny was from Mansfield, not far from Columbus, and had many connections. I wanted to locate my ex-wife and son, just to know where they were and what name they were using. I had no intentions beyond that. We met, and I provided him with my ex-wife's last known address, her name, social security number, and my son's name. I didn't know her current last name, so I left that to him. In less than a week, he had all the information I needed. He filled me in, shook my hand, and refused my payment, saying, "You're a friend of Tiny, so your money's no good here. I know what you did for him. If you need anything else, just call. I'll get it for you." I thanked him and watched him leave. Despite my prison experience, the friendships I made there were meaningful and had their own rewards. Back at my apartment, I heated a meatloaf and mashed potatoes dinner and took it to the small table by a full wall of windows. As I sat down with the envelope from the PI, I opened it and read the details. Nancy Montoya, age 35. Son, Ruben Montoya, age 14. Address, details attached. Local phone number, included. No phone listed for Ruben. It was interesting that she hadn't changed her name, perhaps to maintain the same surname as our son. I was surprised she hadn't remarried or had anyone adopt Ruben. She was a striking woman who could attract many men, but maybe she was just living with someone now. The report continued, Miss Montoya and her son live in a small bungalow in a subdivision of Groveport. There are no other residents in the home. She works at a veterinary clinic in Groveport, while Ruben is in the 9th grade at a local school. There were no records of civil or criminal activity for either of them. No known male friends for Nancy, but she does go out with several female friends. Ruben frequently spends time with a friend, Eddie Clemens, who is also 14. Bank records showed a modest savings account, a checking account with normal activity, and one credit card with a current balance of $23,567. The savings account had $154,000, and the checking account had $1,233. Public records indicated a property sale in the Brentwood subdivision of Southern Columbus 3 years ago, with proceeds deposited in a local bank and later transferred to a separate account. There was no record under known social security numbers for the second account, but more information could be obtained if needed. I couldn't recall much from that time, so I accepted the figures without much thought. I had given Nancy everything in the divorce and wanted to leave that house and all its memories behind. Occasionally, I would remember brief, fleeting moments from that period, but they brought no pain. The isolation of the past 5 years seemed to have dulled those memories. I tried to recall that afternoon but only had vague images, with no emotion attached. I set the envelope aside and finished my meal, washed down with a Diet Pepsi, and settled in for an evening of TV. When I looked at TVs, I was impressed by the widescreens and decided to buy one for myself. It was the only luxury I allowed myself, but it was a choice I made. I wanted nothing more than to be left alone, avoiding crowded places and restaurants. For the first 2 years, I took it slow, adjusting to being around people again, and was in no rush. After an unusually busy month, I found that my share of the partnership was substantial enough to buy a vehicle. I debated what to get and eventually purchased a used Ford pickup with cash. I was pleased with the choice and felt it marked the beginning of a new chapter for me. The next year passed without any unusual incidents. I continued to furnish my small apartment with essentials and outfitted my pickup with a new radio and tires. I started branching out, visiting local cafes for occasional meals, and felt more comfortable in my new routine. Life was good and predictable. Then, I received a phone call from my parole officer. I was at home, watching TV, when he called. "Carmine, this is Jack, your parole officer." "Christ, Jack, I know your voice by now. You call every month. What do you want now?" "It isn't time for my report yet, and you know where I spend my time." "Calm down, Carmine. You're still under my supervision for the next 2.5 months. The reason I called is that someone you know contacted me." "Do you want to know who it was?" "Sure." "Who is it?" "It's one of the boys from OSP." "I can't talk to them, can I?" "You're just trying to catch me in a violation." "Actually, it was your son, Ruben. He found out you got out of prison and has been trying to contact you. He left a number after I told him I'd have to check with you first. You don't have any restrictions against talking to family." My son Ruben was looking for me. I hadn't seen him in almost 6 years. He would be a teenager now, grown up. What could I say to him? "He's your son," Jack said. "You'll know what to say as soon as he opens his mouth. Parents usually talk way too much to their kids. All he wants is to talk to his dad, the one he hasn't seen or talked to for a long time." I felt a surge of panic. Why would he want to talk to me? I'm an ex-con. Why would a kid want a dad like that? Jack replied, "Seems your parole was mentioned in the local paper, something like local doc gets parole. Ruben or someone else must have seen it and told him. It's common knowledge now." I hadn't considered that. "What's the deal? Do I call him, or do you? What number did he give you?" "He has a prepaid phone that his mom doesn't know about. She seems protective, tough but fair. Here's the number. The rest is up to you. If you call him, fine. If not, he understands, it's your choice." I wrote down the number, then hung up and just stared at the TV. Ruben, my son. It was one of the painful aspects of the divorce and the prison sentence. I hated that I couldn't see my own son. I know it was my choice, but I didn't feel I had any other option. I didn't want him to see his father stuck in prison. I had caused him and his mother enough grief with my actions. He didn't need to remember me as a convict. When I made the decision to cut all ties, it was for 2 reasons. First, I couldn't forget what I saw that day, and I knew I would have a hard time forgiving Nancy. A clean break seemed best for both of us. I didn't want her trying to convince me that she loved me or that it was a mistake. There was no need for that. It was obviously over between us, so I decided to let it end. The second reason was that a public trial would have haunted both of them for a long time. There would have been press coverage, public judgment, and my son subjected to ridicule and harassment. My wife's affair would have been exposed, and my own instability would have impacted them both. Handling it without a trial and without publicity was cleaner, kinder, and quicker for everyone involved. It took me the entire time I spent in prison to forget, but somewhere during those years, I did. Even now, the thrill of seeing my son again was all I could think about. Nancy was not an issue. I knew I still loved her and probably always would, but she was part of my past now. She had begun her new life without me, and she was better off if I stayed out of it. I thought about it for several days, but I knew I was going to call him. I also knew that my simple, safe life was about to change. Nancy's perspective. My name is Nancy Montoya. My ex-husband Carmine is in prison for assaulting a man and nearly killing him with a baseball bat. It was my fault that it happened, but Carmine paid the price. I tried to help him when he was charged, but he wouldn't let me. He refused to even talk to me while he was waiting for trial. I tried to bail him out, but he refused to be released. I hired one of the best attorneys, but he refused him as well. He accepted a plea bargain and went off to prison. We have a son, Ruben, who was just 9 when all this happened. The worst part was that Carmine refused to allow his son to see him in jail and later in prison. He sent me a short note telling me to keep Ruben away. I decided to divorce him a year later, hoping to get him to talk to me or reconsider, but he refused again. This time, his note told me how much I had hurt him. I gave up, knowing I couldn't reach him and that he would never forgive me. I didn't blame him then and still don't. I never forgave myself. I still remember what happened as if it were yesterday. I still cry myself to sleep sometimes, even now, almost 6 years later. I get so lonely sometimes that I want to do something, go somewhere, be with someone, but I won't. I refuse to be happy or enjoy my freedom while he is in jail. I put him there, and if he has to endure being alone, so will I. It isn't as difficult as it sounds because what I did to him is what I can't forget. That day, that horrible day when Carmine called to tell me he was held over at the hospital, he was supposed to take a job at a fancy clinic as a reconstruction specialist, but he refused. Carmine was a genius at facial reconstruction. When someone had a severe accident and their face was crushed and twisted, they wanted Carmine to be their doctor. Everyone said so. He talked about the offer a month ago, and I was excited. I thought it would allow us to live a more normal life, with scheduled hours instead of the chaotic emergency room shifts. I wanted him to take the offer, even though I knew it wouldn't be his first choice. He loved the trauma ward, the emergencies, and the lives he saved. But if I had to choose between having him home more often and making more money versus him doing something that made him happy, I had to choose time with his family. Carmine was naturally happy, and that was one of the things I loved most about him. But I would rather have him home with Ruben and me. We could also make him happy. We talked about it, weighed the pros and cons, and he finally made the decision. I supported him in taking the job, though he ultimately chose differently. I knew he was pleased with his choice, and I tried to convince myself that it was best for him to be happy. I loved him, and he was happy. What more could I ask for? Indeed, I asked myself what more I could want. How naive was I? That was a week before the phone call. That morning, Carmine had just finished a long shift but was due home to take me shopping for Ruben's school clothes. I wanted to go, and Carmine had promised to come with me. Ruben and I were still asleep when he called to tell me about the emergency and that he had to stay at work. He was in such a hurry that I didn't have time to remind him about the shopping, so I let it go. But the frustration lingered, gnawing at me as I did some laundry. This had happened several times in recent weeks, and I was angry about it. This was what I had warned him about when he turned down the clinic job. As I sorted the laundry, I thought again about the job offer. It would have been perfect, more time, more money, more prestige. All those things we had talked about when we married. Carmine was a wonderful specialist and could take most any assignment he wanted, but he always leaned toward the action, the excitement. I finally accepted that it was who he was, but the question nagged at me, why couldn't he choose us, me and Ruben, over the excitement? Why not us first? I had to admit it really bothered me. Usually, I wouldn't dwell on it, but today my mind was not feeling so forgiving. I was bored and hadn't seen Carmine for almost 28 hours. Since he hadn't called later, he must have decided to work his regular shift and come home later this evening for his 2 days off. I guess it made sense, but I was still upset. I was talking to myself when the doorbell rang. I pushed the start button on the washer and went to answer it. I opened the door to see Hugo Benz, my boss at the real estate office. He was holding some folders and looked frazzled. I invited him in, closed the door behind him, and led him into the family room. "What's up, Hugo? What have you got there? You look like you're not happy." Hugo held out the folder with a smile. "Can I ask you for a favor? Could you type up the offers for me so that I can have them tomorrow morning? It would mean a great deal to me. I'll pay you overtime." I took the folders, glanced inside, and saw they were routine offers, nothing special. I wondered why no one else could do this simple task but put it out of my mind. I quickly agreed and set the folders down on the end table next to me. "Sure, Hugo, no problem. I'll have them done by morning." I chatted with Hugo for a few minutes, enjoying the break in the company. To extend the visit, I asked him if he wanted a beer. He quickly agreed. I got a couple, and we sat down and began talking. I had always liked Hugo, and we often joked around in the office. Today seemed like any other day, and we joked and flirted lightly, enjoying another beer. I started sharing my frustration with Carmine's long hours. The conversation dragged on, so I made us a couple of mixed drinks. the small buzz helped me open up more. Hugo listened, made some comments about how he couldn't understand leaving someone as wonderful as me alone so much, and how he would never do that. I was flattered, and when he moved closer to me on the couch, I didn't mind. I didn't mind when he put his arm around me for comfort as I spoke about my frustration and loneliness. When he held me close, I felt a sense of warmth and comfort. We stood like that for a few minutes before I put my arms around his neck, looking up at him. He didn't hesitate, gently kissing me. As he led me upstairs to my bedroom, talking softly and rubbing my back, I didn't speak. I felt a mix of emotions, desire and confusion. I knew this was wrong and that I was flirting with danger, but I didn't stop. I was tired and frustrated, and I craved companionship. Carmine had chosen his work over me, and now I was going to do something about it. That was all I wanted until it began to be something else, and I didn't stop it. Even now, after understanding the consequences and the damage I caused, I still didn't know why I didn't stop Hugo from unzipping the back of my house dress and pulling it away from my shoulders. It fell to the floor, leaving me in my plain cotton bra and panties. I stared at his face, so close to mine, as I felt my bra slip free. His lips pressed against mine softly, and I wasn't sure if he had actually kissed me. He unbuckled his pants and pushed them down. I found myself sitting on the bed, naked and unresisting. I knew what was going to happen and wanted to say something, but I was too immersed in my emotions to do anything other than allow what was happening. As Hugo began to show affection, it became about the immediate feelings. If it was wrong, I would deal with that later. All that mattered was the present moment, with Hugo and me, and nothing else. Hugo's actions grew more intense, and though I was aware that this was wrong and that Hugo was not Carmine, my thoughts were clouded by the overwhelming sensations. I wanted to stop, but the feelings were overpowering. Just as I felt a climax approaching, Hugo suddenly stopped. I looked up to see a flash of metal and realized that Carmine was standing by the bed, holding a bat. Carmine's face was unrecognizable, twisted in a way that startled me. He swung the bat again, and Hugo screamed. In a panic, I rolled off the bed, trying to distance myself from the violence. Carmine continued to swing the bat, and I knew that if he didn't stop, Hugo would be in serious danger. I made the decision to intervene, jumping onto Carmine's back. He staggered and fell to his knees. I clung to him, but he managed to break free. I fell back, hitting my head against the door. Carmine looked at me with a frightening intensity that was not like him. Terrified, I fled to Ruben's room, using his phone to call 911. I locked the door and hoped that Hugo would survive as I cowered in the corner. I finally opened the door cautiously and saw Hugo lying on the floor, covered in blood but still breathing. Carmine was nowhere to be seen. I got a wet cloth for Hugo's forehead, quickly dressed, and went downstairs quietly. I found Carmine in the family room, sitting with his head down and the bloody bat in his hands. I whispered his name, but he didn't respond. I waited for emergency services to arrive, letting them in and leading them upstairs to Hugo. They took over, and I returned downstairs to wait for the police. When they arrived, they took Carmine and the bat outside. They asked me if Hugo was there with my permission, and I had to admit he was. I didn't realize at the time that I had just implicated my husband in assault. The police questioned me about the incident, asking who Hugo was, who Carmine was, and whether Carmine had assaulted Hugo after finding him with me. I admitted to the sequence of events but noticed their judgmental looks. After giving my statement at the police station, I requested to see Carmine, but an officer informed me that he had refused to see me. I had arranged for our neighbor to look after Ruben, but with Carmine's decision, there was nothing else I could do. I returned home to deal with the fallout of my actions. I hired a highly regarded attorney in Columbus, who said he could argue for temporary insanity based on Carmine's exhaustion and work hours, calling it impaired response syndrome. I was hopeful that Carmine would be acquitted. When the prosecutor asked me to testify against Carmine, I refused. He threatened to subpoena me, but I still refused. I had the law on my side. I couldn't be forced to testify against my husband, and I wouldn't. During this time, the only things that kept me sane were taking care of my son and fighting for my husband's freedom. I was constantly in touch with lawyers, the police, or anyone who needed information. I took steps to secure our finances for his defense, posted his bond when my attorney arranged it, and prepared for the trial. My guilt was set aside as I focused on getting Carmine out and back home with me and Ruben. That became my sole purpose. My attorney informed me that Carmine had refused bond. I was puzzled but learned that it was Carmine's right to refuse. Although few people chose this option, he had declined the conditions of release, which meant his bond was revoked, and he remained in jail. Subsequently, when my attorney went to see him, Carmine dismissed him and requested a court-appointed lawyer. His finances were frozen due to his arrest, qualifying him for a public defender. Carmine refused to communicate with me and I was barred from visiting him. I was unable to see or speak to him, and he had closed me out completely. I went home and spent hours in the spare bedroom, where I broke down in tears. My guilt, which I had suppressed for so long, overwhelmed me. I cried for the next 2 days, unable to function. I was acutely aware of the pain I had caused Carmine and the loneliness that lay ahead for Ruben and me. The fault was mine alone. 2 days later, I collected myself and went to pick up Ruben from Carmine's sister, who had been caring for him while I was engaged in legal battles. I had to face her and explain the situation, knowing she was aware of my actions. Her response was unexpectedly supportive. She didn't blame or scold me. Instead, she asked how she could help. I requested that she continue looking after Ruben, which she did without hesitation. I resigned from my job, as continuing there was untenable. Even though Hugo was in the hospital, the circumstances made it impossible for me to stay. I didn't harbor hatred for him, I blamed both of us equally. Our actions had led to a tragic situation, and there were no satisfactory explanations for why I had let it happen. Regret wouldn't change the past. I loved my husband deeply and always would. Despite the mistakes, my feelings for Carmine remained unchanged. The pain I felt was a consequence of my own actions. Ruben returned home, and I began the process of adjusting to life without Carmine. I hoped he would be released soon, even though he had refused my help. Ruben knew his father was in jail and why, but he was too young to understand the full context. I kept him in school and tried to maintain normalcy for him, focusing on the positive side of things. A week later, I visited the jail to see if Carmine needed anything. Although he still wouldn't see or speak to me, I asked the guards to check if he needed anything from home. The guards seemed surprised to see me. "Hello, Mrs. Montoya. What are you doing here today?" "Hello, Fred. Can you see if my husband needs anything from home?" "I know I've asked before, but he might have thought of something he needs." Fred replied, "He's been moved to the penitentiary in Youngstown. He accepted a deal and began serving his time there 2 days ago." "You didn't know?" "No, I didn't know. No one told me he had been moved or accepted a deal. Why would he do that? He could have been found innocent or at least sent to a hospital for a short stay." I turned and blindly walked out the door, grappling with the reality that my husband had chosen to deal with his future without me or our son. I was hurt and confused by his decision, especially since it involved Ruben, his only child. I understood his anger towards me, but his disregard for our son was difficult to accept. I called my lawyer, the one Carmine had dismissed, and asked him to find out what happened. Later that day, he informed me that Carmine had pleaded guilty to a reduced charge of simple assault and received a 7 to 10-year sentence in the Ohio State Penitentiary. Carmine's court-appointed lawyer revealed that Carmine had refused any appeal or further attempts to reduce his sentence, and he had begun serving his time earlier that week. This was when I lost hope. My husband was not coming home anytime soon, and I was left alone with Ruben. Ruben became my anchor during the day, but at night, when I was alone, the memories of my actions haunted me. The pain of what I had done was overwhelming. I remembered Carmine's devastated expression when he found me with Hugo, and the look of blankness on his face as he held the bat. I recalled the dead look in his eyes as the police took him away. The details of what happened with Hugo were a blur, leaving me with a void I couldn't fill. A week after Carmine started his sentence, I arranged for a new bed to be delivered and the old one removed. Sleeping in the old bed with memories of what I had done had caused too many sleepless nights. The new bed offered a temporary relief. I also had the house appraised and began planning to sell it, as I needed to find a job to support myself and Ruben. Hugo had recovered and requested to see me. I went to confront him, making it clear that we were no longer working together and that he was no longer welcome in my life. Hugo, however, threatened to sue Carmine in civil court for damages if I didn't continue our relationship. He said he would ensure Carmine never had a penny to his name once released. In response, I threatened Hugo with legal action for harassment and unwanted advances. He laughed, but I insisted I was serious, even reaching for the phone to call my lawyer. After a heated exchange, Hugo agreed to drop the threat. As I left, he tried one last time to intimidate me, promising to pursue legal action against Carmine for the rest of his life. I chose to believe his threats were just bluster. Almost a year later, I decided to move forward with my life. I filed for divorce, planned to sell the house, and buy a smaller one for Ruben and me. I ensured there was enough money for Ruben's college fund. I also found a job as a receptionist at a small veterinary clinic, which provided a stable income. I sent Carmine a letter with the divorce petition, asking to explain my actions and to see if there was any chance for our family to remain intact. I hoped it might provide some clarity or possibility of reconciliation. Carmine's response, however, was final and devastating. He congratulated me on my new life with Hugo and made it clear that he wanted nothing from me. He agreed to whatever terms I worked out but wanted to be free of me. Seeing his words in writing felt irrevocable, and I was overwhelmed with grief, spending the next day in tears, reliving the pain of my betrayal. After getting my emotions under control, I wrote a brief note to Carmine to inform him that Hugo and I no longer had any contact and that I had left the company. I knew it wouldn't change anything, but I didn't want Carmine to believe Hugo was still part of our lives. I ensured that the prison doctor would make sure Carmine received the letter I sent. That was all I could do, but I needed to move forward to provide for myself and our son. Once the divorce was final, I sold the house with some regret. It was worth quite a bit, and I took 3/4 of the proceeds and deposited it into a separate account for Carmine. He wouldn't know about it until he was released. I felt it was the least I could do for him. I found a small bungalow that was just right for Ruben and me, close to the veterinary clinic where I worked, and bought it outright. This way, I wouldn't have to worry about mortgage payments. I enrolled Ruben in school, where he quickly made friends and began to adjust. He stopped asking about his father once I convinced him that Carmine was too far away to visit. We started our new life, and time passed. Years later, when Ruben was 12, he asked me why his father was in prison. It was a question he had asked before, and I had always tried to avoid answering, but this time he wouldn't let it go. Someone had told him that his father was in the penitentiary for nearly killing a man, and Ruben wanted to know the details. I decided it was time to tell him the whole truth. I sat him down and explained everything, not sparing myself any details. Ruben listened quietly and, after I finished, simply said, "I don't blame Dad for doing what he did. He had to do it." Then he walked away and didn't mention it again. I had expected some form of recrimination, but none came. Ruben accepted the truth and moved on, or so I thought. Now let's hear the story from Ruben's perspective. When I was in 7th grade, my best friend Eddie told me he had found a news clipping in his mother's things about my dad being arrested for assault with intent to kill. I didn't want to believe it, but Eddie showed me the clipping, and it was true. My dad had been arrested after attacking a man with my baseball bat. I remember that this happened when I was 9, and it was the last time I saw him. After that day, he never came home. At the time, Mom wouldn't tell me what happened, saying it was something I would understand when I was older. I kept the clipping, and that night, I asked her directly what had happened. Initially, she resisted, but I persisted until she finally sat me down and told me the entire story. She said it was all her fault because she made a serious mistake. She was with her old boss when Dad came home and saw them together. She explained that Dad had a breakdown, which was a result of being overworked and exhausted. When he saw them together, he snapped, took my baseball bat, and hit the man several times before she managed to stop him. She said the man recovered without issues, but Dad was so troubled by what he had done that he couldn't cope and wanted to accept responsibility. Mom tried to get him a lesser sentence, but Dad was too angry to accept her help. He insisted on taking full responsibility and ended up in prison for 7 years. I understood what Mom had done and knew that she had been unfaithful to Dad. She admitted it and didn't try to avoid responsibility. Although I was upset with her, I thought it was commendable that she was honest. I asked Mom why Dad wouldn't see us, and she said it was because he was too proud to have me see him in prison. When I asked if she ever visited him, she looked sad and told me that Dad hadn't spoken to her since that day. She said he couldn't forgive her for what she did, and he wanted to forget about her. She didn't say he wanted to forget about me, so I held on to that information for later. After reflecting on what Mom told me, I realized it was why I sometimes heard her crying late at night. I knew she missed Dad because I heard her talk to Eileen about it. Eileen was still friends with us, even after Mom's actions. Mom had asked Eileen to send pictures of me to Dad, which made me feel a bit better, hoping Dad would see what I looked like. I didn't mention it to Mom again and pretended I had forgotten, but I hadn't. I talked to Eddie, who suggested I speak with one of my teachers, someone I trusted and who treated us kids with respect. I told him where Dad was and asked how I could get in touch with him. He agreed to look into it and get back to me. A week later, he called me to stay after class and provided me with information on whom to contact. I thanked him and began to make my plan. Eddie suggested I buy a disposable phone, which you could get almost anywhere. He said I only had to pay up front and would then have a certain number of minutes before needing to buy more or discard it. I had saved enough money, so we went to CVS and bought one. Once I was alone, I called the Department of Corrections in Columbus and asked for information about Carmine Montoya. When they asked about my relationship to him, I told them I was his son and 18 years old. They believed me and provided the information. I found out where he was and how to contact the prison, but when I called, they informed me that Dad had left specific instructions about who he would accept calls from, and I wasn't on the list. They refused to connect me with him, but I could call for information. I continued to call every few months, hoping to get a chance to speak with him, but nothing changed. That was until my 15th birthday. On that day, they informed me that my dad had been released on parole a month ago. He was free. It was the best birthday present I could have hoped for. When I asked for a number where I could reach him, they provided one. I decided not to tell Mom. I was sure she would try to stop me from contacting him. I knew she would argue that it would hurt him if I called and that he wanted us to move on without him. Despite hearing her, I refused to accept that. I wanted to talk to him, no matter what. After all, she was the one sending him pictures of me, so he had to be thinking about me. I called the number they gave me and reached a man who identified himself as Dad's parole officer. After I explained who I was and my desire to talk to my dad, he said he would contact Dad and let him know. However, he mentioned it would be up to Dad if he wanted to return the call. I understood, but I was hopeful. I gave him my number and waited eagerly. A week later, which felt like an eternity, I received a call on my cell phone. I still had it turned on and charged, even though I hadn't used it for anything else. I was walking home with Eddie when it rang. I stopped in the middle of the sidewalk, paralyzed. It was Dad calling. I stood there, staring at Eddie until he urged me to answer. Hello? Hello, is this Ruben Montoya? The voice was deep, soft but clear. I would have recognized it anywhere. I had heard it in my dreams. It was him. Dad, is it really you? Yeah, it's me. Does your mom know you called me? Is she there now? No. I got a cheap phone, one of those you just buy and activate. She doesn't even know I have it. I was afraid she'd stop me from calling you. I understand. Who gave you my PO number? Pa. He's my parole officer, the one I called. The prison gave me his number. Dad, where are you? Are you coming home now that you're out? Ruben, that's no longer my home. Your mother and I are divorced, and it's for the best. She's moved on, and so should you. That's not true, Dad. She never dates and still cries at night. She's sorry for what she did and misses you. I know she doesn't talk about me, but that's just to make it easier on you. She admitted her mistake and said she was wrong. But it's better if I stay out of your lives. I've been in prison with other violent men, and I'm still learning to live on my own. I'm not the father you remember. Please, Dad. I want to see you and get to know you again. I was just a kid when you went away. I'm 15 now, almost a man. Let me visit you just once. There was silence on the other end, and I thought he had hung up. Just as I was about to speak again, he said, "Let me think about this for a while. I promise I'll call you back. I need to decide what's best. Is that okay?" "Of course, I can wait," I said. I didn't want to, but I did want to see him, and if I got too pushy, he might hang up and ignore me, like adults sometimes do. "Sure, Dad, I can wait. I'll keep the phone turned on. It's best if you call during the afternoon. Mom is usually working then, so it'll be private. Is that okay?" "That's perfect. I'll call you." There was a brief pause before he said goodbye. I pressed the end button on the phone and just stared at it. "So, what did he say? What did he say to you? Come on, Ruben, what did he say?" Eddie was hopping around me, waving his hands in frustration. "He said he'd think about it and call me back. I know he's going to let me see him. I just know it. I'll get to see my dad. Ruben, he's a tough guy, an ex-con. He almost beat someone to death," Eddie said, grinning from ear to ear. "Stop it, Eddie. He's my dad, not just an ex-con. That part of his life is no one's business but his and mine. You can know, but you need to forget about it." "Sure, Ruben, I'll keep it a secret just between us. And if he comes, you have to introduce me. Promise?" "Sure, I promise." But I knew that if he called me back, I would keep it between him and me. My dad, I was going to see him after all these years. I was on pins and needles for the next few days, waiting for his call. It was a Monday afternoon, just a week since I talked to him. I had begun to think he wasn't going to call me back when my phone finally rang. It was just past 3 p.m., and I was on my way home from school. Eddie wasn't with me today because he had band practice. I was alone and in no hurry to go home to an empty house. "Hi, Dad. Is that you?" "Sure is. Can you talk? Where are you right now?" "I'm alone and walking home. Mom doesn't get home for another hour and a half. I have a lot of time." "Good. I've thought about it, and I do want to see you. I just want to meet up once to discuss some important things, but I need you to understand that this is not an attempt to get our family back together. I know that's what you want, but it's not going to happen. Do you understand that? If you don't, I won't do this." I wasn't ready to accept that, but I knew I had to go along with him if I wanted to see him. "Sure, Dad, I understand. I won't tell Mom or anyone. Just tell me what you want me to do." "Okay. You get out of school at 3 o'clock and walk home. Is that right?" "Yeah." "How do you know all that? Who told you?" "I know a lot of people, and they do favors for me. I had someone check on you, that's all." "Is what I said right?" "Yes, it's pretty close." "So, what do I do?" "Nothing out of the ordinary. I'll be there one day next week. Just do what you always do, and I'll find you. It's best if you don't know exactly when. Do you understand?" My heart was pounding with joy. I assured him I understood and would keep this a secret from Eddie and, of course, from Mom. I headed home, happy and content. I could wait another week. It had been almost 7 years since I saw my dad. Now, I was going to be with him. Meanwhile, Nancy had just finished washing a miniature poodle, getting him ready for neutering. The dog, almost 10 months old, was calm and seemed content. Nancy pulled him out of the tub, wrapped him in a towel, and placed him on the table where she would use the blow dryer to complete the job. His tongue was trying to reach her face as she rubbed him with the soft towel. She flipped open her cell phone and held it to her ear while she continued working on the poodle. "Hello, honey. Are you home?" "Yeah, Mom, I'm home. What do you want to do about dinner? Want me to start anything, or should I call for takeout?" His voice always gave her a feeling of comfort, just knowing he was safe and home where he belonged. He was getting older and would soon be going out more, but until then, he was her life, and she treasured him. "That sounds good. Why don't you call for Italian? You like that so well. I'll stop on the way and pick it up. Sound good?" "Sure, Mom. I'll get the pasta and the garlic bread you like." I'm having the meatball sandwich. I'll see you when you get here. Okay, honey. Bye. She dropped the phone into her hand and put it back in her pocket while finishing up with the poodle. He was a sweet dog and made no fuss when she put him back in the cage to wait for his operation. She cleaned up around the table and the cages before clocking out. She was done at 4:30, and the late shift would handle the actual operation. During the day, we primarily handled examinations and shots. I did x-rays, some teeth cleaning, and a few shots, but more often assisted Dr. Jane, the veterinarian. She gave me this job and made sure I learned the ropes. She was a lifesaver for me at a time when I was at my lowest. I never told her the whole story, just that my actions had led to my divorce, and that was that. She didn't press me in any way and simply offered me an ear if I wanted one. I changed out of my uniform and into my street clothes, then shut my locker. There were 8 of us all together, so we each had a locker and a mail slot of our own. I didn't bother with a lock for the door and just trusted my coworkers to leave my stuff alone. So far, nothing had been touched, and I had no reason to believe it would be otherwise. I punched the time clock, waved goodbye to the 2 girls who had come on for the second shift, and left. I was talking to myself, going over the things I had to do on the way home, when my cell phone rang. That was a surprise since only my son had the number. The caller ID showed only that the call was from Columbus, with no specific identification. I debated answering, thinking it was probably a blind call from a salesman. I finally shrugged, flipped it open, and answered, "Hello, this is Nancy. How can I help you?" There was a moment of silence, and I repeated my greeting, "Hello, is anyone there?" This time, someone cleared their throat, then said, "Nan, this is Carmine." I stopped so quickly I almost fell forward. My heart started pounding, my face felt flushed and hot as if I had been running, and I realized I hadn't let out the breath I was holding. I had to say something, anything. "See, Carmine, is this really you?" I asked, though I recognized his voice. I had heard it over and over the last 7 years, even though our last conversation had ended in anger when he didn't take me shopping. The last thing he had said to me was about the accident he needed to stay and help with, which had made me angry at the time. "It's really me. I had to call you to let you know that Ruben contacted me." "Did you know he did that? Did he tell you?" His voice was calm, without anger or condemnation. It still sounded like the old Carmine, but without the warmth I remembered. Why did I expect there would be anything left after all this time? "No, I didn't know." "How did he contact you, and how did you get my cell number?" "I never gave it to anyone." "Ruben did. He has a cell phone, one of those prepaid ones anyone can buy. I don't know how he activated it, but he did. He called the prison, got the name and number of my parole officer, and then called him. My parole officer told me, and I called Ruben. This was so much information to process at once. My husband, whom I hadn't talked to in almost 7 years, was calling to tell me my son had reached out to him. He was out of prison, and my son knew and had called him. I was still standing in the parking lot, staring off into space, trying to make sense of it all. God, Carmine is out of prison, was the only thought that came to mind. Ruben called him. Ruben was a very intelligent boy and had been taking care of himself for some time. I had no worries about him. He never stopped loving his father, just as I hadn't. I was surprised he had a cell phone but not surprised that he called. Well, I'm not surprised, Carmine. You walked away from us 7 years ago, but he never forgot you. He asked about you for several years after you left, but I thought he had finally given up. I had no idea what happened to you since you refused any contact, and the prison simply said you wanted no contact with me. I didn't even know you pleaded guilty and went to prison until I went to the jail to see if you needed anything. A guard had to tell me, no one else would. And now you're out of jail, and I had no idea. I gave up years ago trying to get you to talk to me. Carmine, I guess Ruben didn't. Carmine didn't answer right away. I waited, but he didn't say anything. I decided he had all he wanted of me, so I said, I guess that's all. Just let me know Ruben contacted you. Well, I'll talk to him and tell him you have no desire to see him or me. That should make his life a lot simpler. Still nothing. I was ready to hang up the phone when Carmine said something that shook me to the core. Wait, Nan. Please, I'm sorry if I'm not always as polite as I should be. It takes time after 5 years in that place. I sometimes forget to answer people when I talk to them, especially when I don't know them very well. He sounded so sad that I felt my heart break for him and what he had to endure. But then, going to prison was his choice. I still felt bad knowing I was at fault in the first place. I told Ruben that I would like to see him again. I told him I would let him know when I'd like to see you as well, if that would be all right with both of you. Oh God, please don't do this. How could I stand to see him again without breaking down? How could I refuse? How could I not refuse? I had built a life without him, a life that was less than I would have liked, but a life nevertheless. I had learned to live without him after years of trying. Now he wanted to see us. I couldn't see him again. Ruben couldn't see him. He wasn't going to stay with us as a family, so I had to stop this before it broke Ruben's heart. I had to say the only thing I could think of to say without destroying my carefully built life. I had to tell him to stay away from us and never contact us again. That's what I had to tell him. Of course, I did. That would be fine, Carmine. We could meet wherever you want, just tell me when and where. Let me call you back. I'll have to arrange with my parole officer to travel to see you. He should let me do that. I'll call you tomorrow. It was good talking to you again. Nancy, goodbye. Before I could say anything more, he was gone, just as quickly as he had entered my life. He was gone again. But he said he would call tomorrow. He would call. I would wait to talk to Ruben until I heard from him again. I wasn't going to get his hopes up for nothing. I drove home to my son, and we shared a meal of pasta and meatballs with lots of cheese and sauce. Ruben always ordered extra garlic bread and loved their lemonade. He ate with a lot of energy and enthusiasm. I knew he had talked with Carmine, but he didn't know I knew. He was bursting to tell me, but he also believed I would be angry with him, so he kept it to himself with difficulty. I smiled and sighed at the happiness radiating from him. He had talked with his dad. The story continues in the next video. Link to part 2 in the description of this video. Thank you for watching and for your likes.